You're listening to LGBT Stories. We tell stories of LGBT people around the world. It's our belief that if we as a community can help anti-LGBT people relate to our shared experiences, then over time, we can assist these same people in finding reason not only to accept LGBT people as a community, but as human, just as they are themselves. As you listen to today's story, I encourage you to listen with an open heart, mind, and soul. While listening, just try to see where you might be able to relate to the emotions of the story. Maybe the act or situations aren't the same as you've experienced in your own life. But what I find compelling about emotion, good or bad, it transcends across the board. It never discriminates against any color, creed, or sexuality. I know that you have at one time or another felt alone, scared, feared for your life. Or maybe some of you have even tried to take your own life as a result of emotions that feel impossible to work your way through. I'm sure if you're listening today, you've overcome those emotions to some degree and have experienced that feeling of knowing who you are as a person, knowing where you stand, standing firm in your truth. Well, that's what these stories are all about. Overcoming the impossible and learning to stand firm in one's truth. And for those of you listening today that haven't yet found that truth, I hope that this episode points you in the right direction. Because it does get better. The stories you hear on this show are being shared in faith that those listening find hope, inspiration, understanding, or whatever else is needed for you in your heart. Those of you of the LGBT community know we hear your stories. And those of you that are anti-LGBT, it is my hope, my sincere hope, that you can hear these stories and you can hear humans speaking. I'm your host, Kevin Gertis. This is LGBT Stories, and here's today's episode. Today's episode is the story of Natalie Woods. You might not know Natalie, but you may know her story. Well, a small fraction of her story. Because Natalie is far greater of a soul than what social media has focused in on when it comes to Natalie Woods. A few weeks ago, Facebook and just about every other social media outlet was filled with a heroic story of a woman eating a meal at a local restaurant who overheard a family in the booth next to her talking pretty negatively about a male in their family who recently came out as gay. You know, after listening to all of the slandering that came from the table next to her, and before leaving the restaurant, Natalie made sure to do her part in showing these people, and beyond her knowing it, showing the world that the LGBT community is filled with lovely, caring souls. Natalie paid for that table's bill. When the family received their check, paid in full, it read, "Happy holidays from the very gay, very liberal table sitting next to you. Jesus made me this way." And at the bottom it said, "P.S. Be accepting of your family." That story, it filled the internet, and Natalie, along with her message, became an overnight viral message. I read the article about Natalie and what she did, and I knew that I wanted to have her tell her story on our show. What I would soon find out is that Natalie hadn't had the opportunity to tell her life story. With all of the news outlets that reached out to her, all of the people who wanted to know the drama around this simple human act, there was one thing that hadn't gotten touched on. There was one thing that Natalie shared with me that no one other than our show had asked her. Who's Natalie? What makes her the person she is today? What about Natalie's life is it that made her the kind of person who would act in such a heroic way? It's these things that I think will make society a better place. The more we understand why people do what they do, what people are made up of, and the love that is in their hearts, the more we can understand that, have compassion and empathy for that, the more united we'll become. She didn't get to do it before, and now is her day. Today, Natalie finally gets to tell her story.
So my name is Natalie Elaine Woods, and I was born in Odessa, Texas. Basically, Odessa, Texas is known for its mesquite bush and dirt, its rhinestones, and revivals. In 1985, a gallon of gas was $1.09, and a movie ticket was $2.75. I was born into this world prematurely, but with a full head of copper hair. My dad was in the oil field, and my mom was a pastor's kid. That meant that she came with Sunday school mornings and an apron. I was a fighter, and I always have been. Because I was born prematurely, I spent a lot of time in an incubator as a baby, and then with lots of breathing problems as a child. I've always had that sassy, charismatic, outgoing ability to have a conversation with anybody about anything. I actually have 5 Southern Baptist pastors on one side of my family. I was always expected to be good. I was always expected to excel. And my Sunday dresses were handmade by my great-grandmother. What's interesting from all of this, growing up in a home that was so conservative and strict to an extent because of my father, we basically played house. A lot of times, the churches that my family was involved in didn't actually know what was going on behind the scenes in my home. My dad traveled in and out of the country because of his job in the oil field. He was gone for a month, and then he'd be home for a month. And whenever he was gone, it was kind of like a ray of light and sunshine came pouring through all of the windows in the front door because we weren't afraid anymore. My dad, as the older I got and the more I began to look like a woman, became more abusive physically and verbally. I was lucky because I had a mom who talked to me like I was an adult from a very early age. I was homeschooled most of my younger years, and we spent a lot of our time in the parks in Houston, Texas, learning about bugs and Beethoven, talking about the majesty of trees. And she'd always say, if you look closely enough, you can always see the good in the world. My dad was really hard to live with. He was so obsessive about what was going on in our home whenever he was at home because he'd been gone for a month. I would be physically attacked for things like leaving the back door open or my closet light on. He would take a crayon and draw a line in the bathtub showing how much bath water I could have. Um, these moments were very hard, but he would go away and then things would settle and I would get to spend time with my mom and my brother and the world that we lived in. My mom has a great imagination. She has always read 3 to 6 books a week and is always telling their stories or explaining why she's inspired by them. When I was 12, my dad had his final affair and decided to leave us. My mom hadn't worked in 13 years, and we had to start all over from scratch. It was one of those situations where he could afford a good lawyer, and my mom didn't have anything. Everything was taken from us, our home, our car, sentimental items such as even family videotapes. We moved in with a lady named Dorothy who had been a family friend for most of my mother's life and all of my life. She lived in a beautiful home in Odessa, Texas, and we moved in with her. While it was a trying time, I was also 12 and then 13 and obsessed with people like Lisa Loeb and Alanis Morissette and Janet Jackson and any female that came across MTV. I was inspired by female musicians and the angsty music that poured through my television. I had a best friend named Grace. And Grace was the pastor's daughter at the church whose youth group I attended. And she was a thin, knobby-kneed, interesting person. She kind of looked like what you would imagine would be the ad on the cover of a Irish beer poster. But she was my best friend. But she slowly became more than that. I thought that every 13-year-old girl had pictures of their best friend plastered all over their walls. We're talking every corner. We would talk friends at sleepovers into going home so that we could kiss each other in my little bunk bed and pretend that nobody else existed. She never kissed me on the mouth. She only ever kissed me on the side of my lips as if to remind me that I wasn't a boy. But I never cared. Because I was involved with this youth group at different youth events, they would do the call for people to either commit their lives to Jesus or recommit their lives to Jesus. And I remember Heather throwing herself on the steps of the church amongst the congregation and crying and praying for God to forgive us. I didn't know what she was talking about until 10 years later. Because to me, I didn't know that there was anything wrong. I didn't feel ashamed until she told me I was supposed to be. My mom eventually remarried. She married a man named Dale. He kind of looks like Popeye. He's an auto mechanic, and when I first met him, I was shocked that my mom wanted to date him because I thought he was really dorky. But the truth is, he ended up being the best thing that's ever happened to my family. He really taught me the true meaning of what it is to give and what love is, sometimes even silently. I would watch him fix little old ladies with purple hair. I would watch him fix their cars for free, and he wouldn't let them argue with him or take their money. He treated everybody the same that came into his shop, no matter what they look like, no matter their ethnic background. And he gave and gave and gave when people didn't have anything to spare. And he did it quietly. And that to me is where I really learned what it was to love. When I was in junior high, I was the president of the Fellowship of Christian Athletes. I spewed homophobia. I took on the example that was set before me in some instances of my life with hellfire and brimstone. I was self-righteous, and I thought that I was better than everyone, when really on the inside I was crippled with my attraction to women and my desire to be more. Mediocrity has always been my greatest fear. It wasn't too far towards the end of those years that I became involved in the theater. And for anybody who's ever been involved in the theater, everybody knows that that's quite the liberal world. You see and experience everything new, and it's a safe space and a safe place for the weird and the different and the strange. It was the first time in my life that I felt accepted. It was the first time in my life that I could kiss other girls and not necessarily hide it, at least not from my cast or my director. I ended up getting a full ride scholarship for theater for college. And I was excited, but I was also madly in lust with the music in Dallas, Texas. The Dallas music scene had my heart. And because I had played music um, throughout high school in a small local band, I became highly intrigued by the music scene that ran in Deep Ellum, Texas. And so I basically had a job in college, so just so that I could get in my car with my best friend Christy, and we could drive down 2 lanes of highway until they met 4 lanes of highway where we felt free and like we could be ourselves. It was interesting to find myself in spaces and concerts and music venues, singing on the top of my lungs, and realizing that the way that I felt towards the music in these spaces was the same way that I felt listening to praise and worship on any given Sunday morning. I never quite gave up on my faith, and I still haven't. But at that time, I was terrified of coming out. I was 21 and at the time making money by taking bands' pictures and portraits and um, selling weird art. Um, and I fell in love with everything that was different and everything that I hadn't been exposed to. Growing up in the Permian Basin, which I actually graduated high school from Permian High School. It's the same high school that Friday Night Lights was written about, and they filmed it my senior year. Growing up there, I missed out on so much. even things like sushi were so foreign to me. It was culture shock. But it was a culture shock that I dived into head first because I was so in love with all of it. Even the eyeliner on the men around me and the sequins on the women around me. It was cool to be different. It was cool to be scarred, to have a past. My best friend asked me to marry him. His name was Josh. And he was one of those people that as soon as you meet him, you want to live in his area code. He's so funny and has this light about him. And he was a drummer for a couple of different local bands. And I remember when he asked me to marry him, being completely shocked and mortified. I think I knew it was coming, but I thought, if I marry this man, then everything will just fall into place. And because I was so concerned about not having sex, because that had been drilled into my mind for the last 10 years, don't have sex, don't have sex, I wasn't worried because I thought that all of those pieces would fall together and then I would be and feel normal. That didn't happen. The only reason why I went through with our wedding was because my parents had spent so much money and I felt guilty. And for as dramatic and RuPaul as this sounds, walking through the double doors of that tiny church to marry that man, the only thing ringing in my ears was "The Show Must Go On" by Queen. Tears trickled down my face, and everybody thought that I was just really happy. But really, I felt like I was signing my life away. The good news is, the pastor who married us forgot to send in our marriage license. So 2.5 years later, after he had asked me multiple times if I was gay, I finally admitted it to him one day. I packed up my things and I moved to Denton, Texas. I didn't know anybody except for a friend I had here who was working on their degree at the University of North Texas. And we would sit outside on her patio and drink almond milk and stare at the moon and have those kind of conversations that I think all friends should have. The deep ones, the gritty ones, the ones that make you reevaluate your life and everything that you stand for. It was the kind of friendship that challenged everything that I believed. My mom ended up having a severe heart attack. She had to have quad bypass surgery and heart valve replacement. She desperately needed me at her side during this time when I was in Denton. And my biggest regret in life is that I wasn't there for her. I didn't know how to be. I didn't know how to deal with the strongest person in my life being the weakest person in my life. I had also just started seeing a girl who was extremely controlling, and I allowed that to come first. I came out to my mom shortly after her surgery, which I think was really selfish and the worst time to come out to her. But for a lot of you listening, probably know that you get to that point where you're just leaking. You're about to explode. You just need to tell the people you love the most, this is who I am. Please love me regardless. And I remember it was an early morning. I think it was a Saturday morning, and she was laying in her bed. I had stayed the night. And I went in her room and I was sitting in my underwear. And what I've always thought was so interesting about that is it's so vulnerable to be sitting almost naked and come out to your mother. And some of her first words were, well, maybe you'll meet somebody who used to be a woman. Which is interesting and funny to me now because I have so many friends in the trans community. But I explained to her that even though she believed that I was being rebellious or sexually deviant, that even if I could never have sex with a woman, that I wanted to be with a woman. She took this rather hard. All of my family, for the most part, did. And in their defense, I think that that's fair. I think that there are YouTube videos of people's families celebrating or making a rainbow cake or, crying with joy. That wasn't my experience. And that isn't everybody's experiences. And some people's experiences are much more traumatic, even to the point that they're homeless. So the fact that it took my mom a little while to come around is okay. Because she's a person too. And every parent has different dreams and aspirations for their children. This just wasn't my mom's. After I felt that disappointment from my family, I started drinking very heavily. I think in the gay community, in the LGBT community even, drinking is highly accepted. It helps you let your guard down. It helps you speak freely. It's that liquid courage that makes it possible to go up and talk to that person that you would normally have the courage to speak to. But my drinking got out of hand, and it's how I slept at night because I was so ashamed of who I was. Terribly ashamed. I remember not eating so that I could just drink alcohol at night. Just so that I could go to sleep at night. Because I didn't know how to come to terms with who I was. At that point in my life, someone was complaining about our rights to get married as LGBT community members. And I said, well, why isn't anybody doing anything about this? And they said, well, haven't you heard of the Human Rights Campaign? I said, no. And they were like, well, look it up. You need to educate yourself on these things. If you care, you need to learn. So I did. That's exactly what I did. I looked into it. I found a space to volunteer in Dallas at Pride, and I went. I went by myself. I didn't know anybody. I was what I like to refer to as a gaby. And I put one foot in front of the other and jumped right in. And I was surrounded by people with stories that sounded a lot like mine, or stories that were different than mine that I could empathize with, and people that could empathize with me. I found a space. I found a community. I found what had been missing for so long. And slowly but surely, with the Human Rights Campaign over the years, I ended up quite quickly their membership outreach co-chair. And I got to travel to DC multiple times for different events. I was picked one of 22 women to go to their Women in Leadership Conference in DC that they put on every year. And I met a handful of women that I still call my sisters that I got to get to know. I can't tell you how much the Human Rights Campaign did for me. But that being said, my desires and my priorities started to change the more diverse my friends became, the more trans lives entered my life. And once marriage equality was passed, I wanted to change the things in the volunteer work that I was doing. And so I left. I retired very gracefully. I still am in contact with a lot of people from the Human Rights Campaign, but I wanted to do something more for my community, more locally. And I didn't want it to have to be just specifically geared towards the LGBTQ community. I wanted it to be all across the board. I joined Outreach Denton, their steering committee here in Denton, and I work as a steering committee member for them. And they specifically work with the LGBTQIA community, as well as a youth group that identifies as a queer youth group. I get to work with them occasionally on Sunday nights, but I started my own organization called the Denton Verb. And through that, I've been able to volunteer with different places that help people with autism. I've been able to volunteer with the nursing homes, and also even so far as shearing alpacas, because I didn't ever want to say no to people that needed help. I just wanted to live that out. I have marched with Black Lives Matter and Matters, and I have pushed and defended and worked very hard for the minorities that are in my life and the people that are in my life, because the fact of the matter is I'm a cis white privileged woman, and I've learned that my voice sometimes isn't so much what's necessary as my actions. Through all of this volunteer work is when I really started to revisit my faith. And that's hard. I came to a place where I was reading different books and revisiting books that I had read in my younger years and taking from them what I believed was necessary and leaving behind what wasn't relevant. And I've had that question over and over in my mind of, is the Bible something that has just been translated over and over and over and over and over by men throughout all of these years? And the fact of the matter is that it has. Even the KKK uses scripture to try and reinforce their ideologies and the people that follow them. Scripture can be made into anything. I think it was important to me to find a place for God in my life without the stress of needing all of the answers. And I think that as we mature as people, the more you know, the more you realize how little you know. And I've accepted the fact in my life that while no one really has the answers, and I don't believe that we live in a Christian nation, we live in a complete hypocrisy bloodbath, that if I'm going to have faith like a child, then that's exactly what it has to be. I have experienced depression and anxiety throughout the years, as I think that most people in the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, and asexual community have experienced. I have been put on multiple medications for my depression and my anxiety, mostly my anxiety, which is interesting because my social anxiety was always a part of my life, but I was able to control it more when I was younger. And as I got older and after my mom's surgery, it became quite disabling. I actually lost one of my closest friends in 2014 to suicide. She was one of my co-chairs through the Human Rights Campaign. And that definitely was a kick in the teeth and a reevaluation of reality. The pastor at her funeral said that the wolves had come to get her and that they were coming for all of us. And what's interesting is that that church was divided, with the left side being her family and the right side being all of the people we knew from the Human Rights Campaign, as well as everyone that she knew in AA. And he looked directly at us when he said those words. Her mother had put her in a pink casket, and all the pictures that they had laid out, even though she was 34 years old, were all pictures of her from high school. It was as if they had erased her adult life because of shame. And that's why to this day, if someone is being spoken badly about or treated negatively for who they are, I want to stand up and defend them. A lot of times when I meet new people, one of the first things I ask them is, what would you die for? Which is a strange question. A lot of times people look at me like, what, really? But that's an important question to me, because if you don't know what you'll die for, then where is the point in your life? And for me, the one thing that I know that I would die for is equality. And that's not just for me, and that's not just for gay people, but that's for people across the board. I think that love a lot of times looks different for different people. Even with love languages, if you want to get into that, I think that sometimes love looks like buying somebody dinner. Love sometimes looks like protesting in the streets. Love sometimes looks like lobbying or running for local office or making a piece of art or a piece of music, something that someone's going to relate to and empathize with and find themselves in. Because we're all the same. We're all people. We look differently. We sound differently. We come from different backgrounds. But it's still humanity. What's interesting enough is that the world has kind of exploded over what I did. Not this last Friday, but the Friday before, on November 11th. I just happened to be eating dinner with a friend, and the table behind me was speaking about how disgusted they were with their gay nephew, how they wanted Jesus to cure him, and how liberal he is, amongst a slew of personal information about him. I was hurt in that moment because I was scared that maybe there were times in my life, or maybe there still are, that people that know me say those things. So at first I was afraid, and those feelings of shame surfaced. And then I became angry. Not angry at these people, but angry for him, because he wasn't there to defend himself. A lot of the backlash from this has been, you were eavesdropping, or you were listening into someone else's conversation. And the fact is, these people were in such close earshot range of me that it was impossible for me not to hear their words. And I could have disregarded it. I could have let it go. But I thought about the Jesus that I grew up learning about and seeing truly seeing through some of my family and truly seeing through my mom. Because if anybody's ever shown me selfless love, it was her. And then I thought about Michelle Obama, who has always been an inspiration to me. And at the Democratic National Convention, she said, when they go low, we go high. And I thought, now's the perfect time to do that. So I asked our waitress for the check, and I wrote on it. I paid it, and then I wrote on the receipt, and I wrote, "Happy holidays from the very gay, very liberal table sitting next to you." I signed my name, and then I said, "P.S. Be accepting of your family." I can see how that would come off as self-righteous or maybe an act of attention, but the fact of the matter is that's not where my mind or my heart was at all. It was, maybe if I do something kind and compassionate towards these people, I'll be able to show them that liberals and gays or gay liberals are compassionate, kind, loving people. And that's the beautiful part of our community. That's why our community became what church is supposed to be for so many people. We're the people who walk hand in hand down the streets. We're the people that are in love with music that unites us. We love confetti and glitter and sparkle and all of the things that are shiny and bright that the world can see as an example of our souls. So my giving to these people was a very tiny, very small act of love. And that's all it was. I took a picture of the receipt, and at first I really didn't want to post it on social media. I was always taught to give it, anonymously or quietly. But in this instance, because the world, at least within America, I mean, the world is as well, but in America right now, people are so scared of what's going to happen. The tensions are so high because of this election. I don't really believe that anyone thought we would be here with Mike Pence as our vice president, who is talking about conversion therapy for us. That's terrifying when we've worked so hard to be where we're at now. This year alone, there were more trans lives lost than there ever have been before. And the scary part is, how many more lives are there going to be? How many people from all different backgrounds and ethnic backgrounds are going to lose their lives? The black men in my life are afraid to drive to the grocery store at night because they don't know if they're going to get pulled over. We've come to a place in America where it's scary to exist. And it's so important for us as individuals to be that hope to each other and to know that we're not going to step down or give up, because love is unending. Love isn't selfish. Love is the only thing we have to hold on to right now. My life dream since I was, I think, 9 was to work in orphanages in China when I found out that there were so many little girls flooding these China orphanages. And I wanted to go. I told my mom when I was 9, "Mom, I'm supposed to go. This is what I'm supposed to do." And she said, "What do you want me to do? Put you on a plane?" And I said, "Yeah." I've never had that opportunity, and I hope that I do. And I've also always wanted to work with AIDS patients in Africa. And those are my big life dreams. But more importantly, right now and in this moment is what I'm doing and what we're doing for our own community. Because America has become a scary place, but we have to be the safe in that scary.
Well, there you have it. That is Natalie's story. It's all those little stories that led up to that one defining moment. All the little expressions, all the small emotions. All of this is what shapes Natalie and us all into who we are and what we do with the lives we've been given. Whether you're listening to this episode and you're someone who is LGBT, you have a family member who is LGBT, and you want to learn more about the community, or you're anti-LGBT, and this somehow stumbled upon you. Maybe you're someone who is still in the closet struggling to find your own path in life. Doesn't matter who you are or why you're listening, how you got here. It's nearly impossible to not feel some of the emotions that Natalie felt in her life. While situations and circumstances may be different, emotion never lies. We simply have to be willing to find the commonalities between our own emotions and those of our enemies. It is then that we can begin to find that safe in the scary, as Natalie so beautifully mentioned. If you listen to today's episode and you have something that you want to chime in, you want to further this conversation, maybe you have a question and you need help. This is what this show is about. It's about inspiring people, motivating people, answering questions, just being a community. I encourage you to reach out to us. You can email lgbtpodcast@gmail.com because we're a community, all of us, LGBT and not. We are a community of humans, and we're here, this show is here, to love and to express. Until next time, keep loving one another.